for discussion. So please raise your hand and use the microphone, which is somewhere around here. Yeah. Nan, please.
Okay.
Thank you. I thought that was a really delightful 15, 20 minutes. Great to look at all those paintings, and it's a really interesting paper. I'm struck by. I guess I want to also turn to the conclusion as well, and suggest another possible sort of a moment of meditation, which is that it seems that all the paintings, especially the Impressionist paintings, but the posterized visions of pollution as well, suggest a sort of sad truth about pollution, which is that it makes everything prettier. And I wonder whether that's not a moment for us to start meditating on the connection between aesthetics and the law. So not so much that these paintings suggest, as you say, David, the presence of environmental legal norms in historical contexts, but rather the ways in which legal norms interact with certain visions of aesthetic history, right? I mean, that you make a very convincing case, I'm not sure you were trying to make it or not, that Impressionism is in large part about pollution. And you said at the very beginning that these paintings are gorgeous. So I'm just wondering whether you have any sort of sense of what it is about the beauty, the aesthetic stunningness of the smoke, of the air pollution, that may have interacted with the law in not in a one-dimensional way, but in a way that raised issues that the law needed to be concerned about in terms of the aesthetics in general. So anyway.
Sort of a more specified version of this general observation that Nan just made. I was interested in this Impressionist moment as, in some way, generative in relationship to the emergence of pollution. And I wonder if it would allow potentially both for a different reading of our understanding of the temporality of Impressionism, and also a way in which Impressionism provides a kind of structure for dealing with some of what have come to be the legal issues surrounding sort of environmental recompense and things like that. Because it does give one of the things that your account of your readings of the painting or your collection of this archive makes available to me is a sense that our usual sense of the unit of oscillation that is of temporal oscillation that is producing the impression may be a larger period of time than what we're given to think. We're given to think that we're seeing this in the moment, and what we're getting is the momentariness of it. But what your account actually suggests is that we're given a larger sense of oscillation, a larger sort of trajectory of the environment under transformation. And if that's the case, then the transformation of this into a kind of momentary thing might help deal with some of the issues surrounding, contemporary issues surrounding environmental reparations. Like, what does it mean for us to be responsible for damage that was done in a certain, 50 years ago? And there's a way in which it seems to me that the version of Impressionism that you've given, that gives a sort of longer trajectory of oscillation, might be part of making palpable to people the sense of the kind of necessity for a version of reparation that can take a longer, can view the present in relationship to a much longer trajectory.
Have allocated us 10 more minutes for discussion, so you will have the chance.
Oh, thank you to the organizers. Thank you for all those comments. Also from yours, I basically agree with everything everyone said. Let me just say a bit more. There are cultural, and this is mostly in response to Nan. There are cultural histories of pollution in the 19th century, which talk about reasons why people liked pollution. So, for instance, if you thought that bad airs and miasmas were responsible for disease, so smoke looked like a good way to get rid of those bad airs. And so in Israel, I don't know if they do it in the States, but in Israel, carbolic smoke ball is like a classic first year contract. So I guess it's in States also, right? So that's a good example of that, where people want to breathe in the smoke to protect them from the bad stuff which is in the air. So that's part of it. Part of it is there's a physical reason why pollution is beautiful. I mean, it gives you more beautiful sunsets, which is part of what Monet is doing in his things. And then there's the smoke itself, which is interesting. The smoke itself, even not at sunset, just the black clouds. There's something about it, especially if it's coming out of a locomotive, or when you see it, the plumes coming out of some powerful engine. There's something very powerful in a positive way about that. And so it is interesting to me, and you see a lot of that both in the 19th century as well as later, like in the machine age, 20s and 30s. It's interesting to me that despite all that, you do have this countercurrent. So it's interesting to me that Dufy in 1905 was able to look at the same channel ports that Monet and Pissarro and other impressionists are looking at and saying, this is not just beautiful, this is destruction and this is oppression. So when people actually see through the beauty of the pollution, I mean, that to me is also a very interesting point. But I don't have much more to add to that.
Okay, so we'll take Chris and Levi, and then Ishai and Andreas, and if time permits, if you permit.
So I want to ask, what is the sort of the unit of analysis here, and that we've kind of shifted around from pollution to smoke to environmental transformation, and these don't seem to equate with each other. So I guess my question is, what is pollution? If someone painted a mob of sheep in Australia, one could make an argument that that was a painting of pollution, in that that is an introduced species that is ruining, through its activity, ruining a landscape. And yet, so the basic question is, what is pollution? What are we defining as pollution here?
Yes.
Levi Cooper from Bar Ilan. You said, David, I enjoyed your paper. You said that it was you wanted to focus on methodology. So, two quick points. One is, I think methodologically, when you write best viewed in color, that's great. I mean, who doesn't want to read a paper that starts off that way? So that really worked on me. On a more serious note, I think that you asked a question that I'm still wondering about. How do we actually use art? Miri, you spoke about a corpus of visual evidence. And I'm wondering, how do we actually use that corpus? And I want to give 3 examples, 2 from your paper, and maybe add 1 more. We know that artists don't necessarily draw what they see. They draw, they draw what they want to see or what they would like to see. So there's a concept of artist's lines and perspective. So if we're thinking about the Monet painting of the shore, it's possible, I could imagine, that there was a defector. And that because the artist wanted to show the perspective, he or she may not have drawn that defector. Similarly, with a chimney stack, if chimneys, factories are considered to be a sign of progress, so an artist sitting on the shore, seeing chimney stacks and not seeing smoke bellowing out of them, may have added in the smoke because they want to show a different picture. That's what they see rather than what is. And the third example comes from my field, where I'm dealing in the Hasidic environment of Poland, and in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries, there's a preponderance of pictures of men and very few women. And if I take that as a corpus of visual evidence, I might think that the Hasidic society was only men. So I'm confounded how do you actually use this corpus of physical evidence.
Yeah. No, go
Okay.
ahead.
So great questions. So first to Chris, I tried to. Okay. Well, so yes, I'll get. Okay, so let me start with Levy then. I mean, I completely agree, and because I agree that art is subjective in all the ways you describe, and so for some aspects of my paper, I think that actually increases the value of art because of its subjectivity. So like you said, or like Leora said too, about the women not being in the depictions, that itself tells you something about the people who are painting and what they think about it. So I would say the same. I totally agree with you. I think in some of these cases, the artists may have added smoke into the picture where they didn't actually see it. But what does that say, right? So when they're adding the smoke in where it doesn't actually, where it may not have actually been there, or there's, I didn't talk about it in the paper, but you could do the same kind of analysis of the English were very aware in the mid-19th century of how horribly polluted the Thames was, and yet there's this legislation going on at the time. They're trying to clean it up. And so, I even saw like one person who said, okay, well, we know this such and such a law was passed in such and such a year, and then 10 years later we have this work of art or cartoon or whatever it is complaining about the pollution. So does that mean that the law failed to achieve its objectives? Well, it might, or it might mean that the artist perceived the Thames still as a highly polluted place, and that also tells us something, even if it was less polluted. The fact that people were still relating to it as a polluted place tells us something about the way what law's effects are. So I mean,
maybe they were just nostalgic in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's yes, I agree. Like people can also be nostalgic about scenes of destruction. Whether it's rusted factories, abandoned factories, or whatever it is. So people may build up an association in their head that this is a place where smoke is. This is a place where dirty water is, and paint it. Work it into their works of art, even when it's not there. But that also tells us something about how people. So first of all, how people relate to the environment, and then second of all, how they're going to be relating to the law. For instance, will there be continued reform efforts on the law because people are perceiving the environmental problem to still be there, even when it may not actually be there? So I agree that's an important point. And to Chris's question, I intentionally used pollution in an anachronistic way in this paper and in most of my historical research. In other words, when I say I'm looking for evidence of pollution, I mean pollution as we define it today. Pollution actually back then usually did not mean what environmental pollution. Pollution usually meant what today. I think today we think that a figurative sense of pollution meaning spiritual pollution or whatever. That was the primary sense back then, and the environmental sense was the secondary meaning. I mean, this also goes to Mary's point about smoke and pollution. So I totally agree that they would not have necessarily called a mob of sheep an environmental problem. But looking at it today, we can say this was an environmental problem in some sense. And then it's interesting to think about how people viewed it at the time. And exactly that point, they may not have viewed it. Those are actually the easy cases where people at the time did not view it as an environmental problem. So that helps explain why there's no law, possibly, no regulation of the topic, which is one of the questions we're trying to get at in general, and people are trying to get at in general in this field. Like, why does environmental law come so late when the problems came so early? So besides the answer that it didn't come as late as people thought, the way people thought about the problems is important. Anyway, sorry.
So it goes a little bit to the methodology of using art, and when you said that actually you moved to journalism and kind of that it poses a question, so to me it actually brought the problem of looking art as representational in any way, rather than as in performing in a completely different realm. Okay, so art is not, of course, it's also representational, and you could do that, but the question is what you lose by this kind of shift, and then you would have to move to what art, or the way art functions. Art functions as actually demonstrating something in reality that people don't see, or bringing into light something that only the artists see, or dealing with internal problems of art. So kind of going with it a little bit, so are you also reading artists' texts? So what did Monet not just mean, but what was he thinking he was doing, right? I mean, was he actually dealing with questions of colors and forms, and how do these relate to your problem of pollution? I actually don't have an answer, but but just kind of missing or bracketing the question of the unique function or role of art and artists, and only seeing it as representational seems to me to be missing something. And then just one last thing about the ideology of beauty. So again, is there something that you think happens also to the concept of what counts as beautiful, or not just as artistic, right, but as beautiful? And then you could connect that to journalism or to other representational forms or to other domains where the beautiful is being seen. And do you think that actually it's also a moment where there is a unique connection between ideology and aesthetics is being formed?
Great. Because that's exactly the point I wanted to make about representation. I mean, before that, I also wanted to pick up on Irene's point about the temporality, because I think what you're doing with Impressionism is what we're doing now with the Anthropocene. That is to look back at the carbon sedimentation of humanity on the crust of the Earth and reconstruct a history of presence, of human presence, but through the whole machine of the Anthropocene, which essentially has been, I mean, there are several ways of looking at it, but essentially one of the biggest ways of looking at it is as a responsibilization of the human. And it's quite interesting because for the Anthropocene, art has been strategically present. And in all the kind of studies and kind of big projects, and the Berlin project, for example, the Anthropocene, art is absolutely central in that. So this tells us something that I think, I mean, exactly what Shay's point of view was, and I wanted to pick up on that, the question of representation. Because what you did was really beautiful, but I felt that it was on a representational level. So you took the representation a little too seriously. And what you missed, I think, was precisely the materiality of Impressionist painting. And it really is fascinating how, I think the coup of Impressionism was the materiality that is coming out of the canvas. Because then when they were using the impasti, when they were using this thick layer of painting, they're actually talking about les taches colorées. Tache is the stain. So they were polluting the canvas themselves with their own presence. So the whole idea of being able to see the Anthropocenic movement of the hand, of whatever they were using, sometimes even the finger, moving around, and all that. This is the moment of pollution. And in that sense, I don't think that kind of either an aesthetic judgment of the type beautiful or not, or a kind of judgment in the sense, is art political or not, is appropriate. I mean, yeah, so what? But that there's a different story here, and the story is what the Impressionists were doing, and it was a critical description, as it were, but also by placing themselves very much into it as responsible for the materiality of what they were producing.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, those are all great points to which I don't have great responses. I mean, there certainly is. I don't mean to deny that art has a whole dimension of form and of technique and of internal artists' conversations. Absolutely, and some of that is, as you suggest, may be useful to my concerns. Although we do get into the questions that Miri raised of, well, who really cares what Monet thought as Monet, or any of the Impressionists? Like, who do they represent? And it's not clear that they represent anyone other than themselves. So to me, to the extent that's true, they become less interesting, and the representational aspect of it is of more interest to me. Although although I definitely concede the problems with viewing these kinds of art in representational terms. I mean, I thought I partially softened that problem by admitting the fact that they're not representing. They're not a one-to-one representation of reality, right? It is about the way they view the world, not the way the world actually is, and that itself matters, how they view the world. But yeah, I'm just saying, I'm happy to continue these conversations. I have to think more about them.
And there were quite a few more people who were interested in asking questions, but that will have to happen over lunch.
Over lunch.
Thank you very much. Andreas, please.